History is a great ocean, and most people are like small boats, tossed about by its waves. But once in a while, a person comes along who is not a boat, but a storm. They do not ride the waves. They create them. Napoleon Bonaparte was such a storm. He was a man born on a small, forgotten island who rose to become the master of Europe. His story is not just about battles and crowns. It is the story of a fire of ambition that burned so brightly it lit up the world, and in the end, consumed the man who carried it. Our story begins on the island of Corsica in 1769. Imagine a place of rugged mountains and wild coastlines, an island with a proud, fierce spirit. Corsica had just become part of France, and its people did not feel French. They were Corsicans. In the town of Ajaccio, a boy was born to the Bonaparte family. They named him Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the second of 8 children. His family was noble, but not wealthy. Think of them as having a famous last name, but not much money in their pockets. His mother, Letizia, was a strong and disciplined woman. She taught her children that hard work and ambition were more important than money. This lesson sank deep into young Napoleon's heart. Because his family was noble, Napoleon had an opportunity that most Corsican boys did not. He could get an education in France. At the age of 9, he was sent to a military school. This was a lonely and difficult time for him. He was a small boy with a strange accent, from an island that many French people looked down on. The other boys, who were sons of wealthy French nobles, made fun of him. They called him an outsider. Instead of making friends, Napoleon made friends with books. He read for hours and hours, disappearing into stories of great leaders and ancient heroes like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He read about military strategy, history, and government. While the other boys played, Napoleon was building an arsenal in his mind. The loneliness did not break him. It forged him. He decided that if he could not join them, he would one day rule them. The feeling of being an outsider created a powerful hunger inside him, a hunger to prove he was better than everyone else. As Napoleon grew into a young man, a real storm was gathering over France. The French Revolution began in 1789. It was a time of incredible chaos and incredible opportunity. The old rules were thrown away. The king was overthrown, and thousands of nobles were executed or fled the country. For a young, ambitious military officer with no connections to the old royal court, this was the perfect time to rise. The revolution was like a massive, wild forest fire. It destroyed the old world, but it also cleared space for new things to grow. Napoleon saw not chaos, but a ladder. His first chance to climb came in 1793 in the port city of Toulon. The city had rebelled against the new revolutionary government and was being protected by the British Navy. The French army was stuck, unable to capture the city. The commanders were old and slow. Napoleon, only 24 years old, was an artillery captain. He studied the maps and saw what the older generals missed. He realized that if they could capture a specific hill overlooking the harbor, they could use their cannons to sink the British ships. To his superiors, it seemed too risky, but Napoleon was convincing. He was full of energy and confidence. Finally, they agreed to his plan. He led the attack himself, fighting bravely and getting a small wound in his leg. His plan worked perfectly. The British ships were forced to leave, and the city fell. For the first time, people in Paris heard the name Bonaparte. He was no longer a lonely boy from Corsica. He was a hero of the Republic. He had shown that he could see things others could not, and was brave enough to act. But the revolution was a dangerous game. Friends one day could be enemies the next. Napoleon was briefly arrested because he was connected to a powerful leader who fell from grace. He learned a valuable lesson. To survive, he needed to be more than just a good soldier. He needed to be politically smart. His next big opportunity came in Paris in 1795. Angry mobs, loyal to the old monarchy, were threatening to attack the government. The government was weak and terrified. They needed someone who was not afraid to act. They remembered the young general from Toulon. Napoleon was given command. He did something decisive and brutal. He ordered his men to fire cannons directly into the crowd. He called it a whiff of grape shot. The rebellion was crushed in hours. It was a bloody solution, but it saved the government. This act showed another side of Napoleon. He was not just a clever strategist. He was also ruthless. He believed that order was more important than anything, and he was willing to use extreme force to create it. He made a name for himself as a man who could solve problems, a man who would not hesitate. The government was grateful. More than grateful, they were a little afraid of this intense young general. Around this time, he also met a woman who would change his life, Josephine de Beauharnais. She was older than him, a widow with 2 children, and a well-known figure in Paris high society. Napoleon, who had spent his life with books and soldiers, was completely captivated by her charm and elegance. He fell deeply in love, writing her passionate and sometimes desperate letters. For him, she was a connection to a world of grace and power he had never known. For her, this rising young general offered security and excitement. They married in 1796. Their relationship was a storm of its own, full of passion, jealousy, and ambition. Josephine was not just his wife. She was a part of his public image, his empress. The government in France was called the Directory. Think of it like a committee of 5 people trying to drive a car. They all grabbed the steering wheel at the same time, arguing about which way to go. The car would swerve and wobble, and it never went where it needed to. The Directory was weak, corrupt, and unpopular. They were happy to send the increasingly popular General Bonaparte far away from Paris. They gave him a difficult job, command of the French army in Italy. The army he was given was a disaster. The soldiers were poor, hungry, and had not been paid in months. Their uniforms were rags. They had lost all hope. Another general might have given up, but Napoleon saw an opportunity. He gathered his soldiers and gave them a speech that would become legendary. He said, "Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." He did not offer them food or money. He offered them glory. He lit a fire in their hearts, the same fire that burned in his own. What followed was a military masterpiece. Napoleon's mind was like a bolt of lightning. He moved his army with incredible speed. His enemies, the Austrians, were used to slow, predictable warfare. Napoleon was the opposite. He would march his men through the night, appearing where he was least expected. He broke all the old rules of war. He was like a brilliant chess player who could see 10 moves ahead while his opponents were still thinking about their first. In a series of stunning victories, he defeated the Austrians and conquered most of Italy. He sent millions in treasure and priceless art back to France. He became a national hero, the most famous man in the country. He was no longer just a general. He was a leader who brought victory and wealth to his nation. He had taken the worst army in France and made it the best. After his success in Italy, Napoleon's ambition grew even larger. He dreamed of emulating his hero, Alexander the Great, and marching east. He convinced the Directory to approve a bold and romantic plan, an invasion of Egypt. His goal was to disrupt Britain's trade route to India, its most valuable colony. This was more than just a military mission. Napoleon took with him not just soldiers, but over 150 of France's top scientists, engineers, and artists. He wanted to conquer not just land, but knowledge. The Egyptian campaign began with a victory. He defeated the Mamluk warriors in the Battle of the Pyramids. "Soldiers," he told his men, "from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries looked down on you." But then disaster struck. The British Navy, led by his great rival Admiral Horatio Nelson, found a French fleet anchored in the Nile Delta. In a devastating battle, Nelson destroyed Napoleon's ships. Suddenly, Napoleon and his army were trapped in Egypt. They were cut off from France. A lesser man would have been finished. But Napoleon was a master of controlling information. This is what we would now call propaganda. He sent glowing reports back to France, describing great victories and scientific discoveries, but he said little about his desperate situation. While his army was struggling with heat, disease, and constant attacks, he made sure the French people only heard stories of glory. The scientists with him made important discoveries, the most famous being the Rosetta Stone, which would later allow scholars to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. But militarily, the campaign was a failure. Here, Napoleon made a cold and calculated choice that revealed his true character. He learned that the Directory in France was weaker than ever and that the country was in chaos. He saw his chance. In 1799, he abandoned his army in Egypt. He secretly boarded a ship and sailed back to France, leaving his men behind. It was a deeply controversial act. He chose his own destiny over the fate of his soldiers. For him, the grand prize was not Egypt. It was France itself. He arrived in France to a hero's welcome. The people did not know the full truth of the Egyptian disaster. They only knew that their great general had returned. Paris was buzzing with plots and conspiracies. Everyone knew the wobbly chair of the Directory was about to collapse. Napoleon, with his immense popularity and the backing of the army, was the perfect man to take charge. Working with a few clever politicians, he planned a coup d'état, a swift takeover of the government. The takeover, which happened on 18 Brumaire, November 9th, 1799, was not as smooth as he had hoped. When Napoleon entered the government hall to speak, the politicians shouted at him, calling him a dictator. For a moment, the great general lost his nerve. He was used to commanding soldiers who obeyed without question, not politicians who argued back. He became flustered and may have even fainted. It was his brother, Lucien, who saved the day by calling in the soldiers to clear the hall. The coup succeeded, but it showed a rare moment of weakness. Even Napoleon could be vulnerable. A new government was formed, called the Consulate. It was led by 3 consuls, but everyone knew who was really in charge. Napoleon was named first consul. At only 30 years old, he was the most powerful man in France. He had completed his climb. The lonely boy from Corsica was now the ruler of a great nation. But for Napoleon, reaching the top of one mountain only revealed a higher one to climb. As first consul, Napoleon showed that his genius was not just for war. He worked with incredible energy, sometimes for 18 hours a day. He wanted to rebuild France, to make it strong, orderly, and efficient. He said, "I have finished the romance of the revolution. Now we must begin its history." He brought an end to the chaos. One of his greatest achievements was the creation of a new set of laws, the Napoleonic Code. Think of a Napoleonic Code like a new, single rulebook for a giant game. Before Napoleon, France was a confusing mess of different laws. A rule in Paris could be different from a rule in Marseille. The code changed that. It gave everyone in France the same set of clear, organized, and mostly fair rules. It protected property rights, guaranteed religious freedom, and stated that all male citizens were equal before the law. It was so logical and modern that many other countries in Europe and around the world later adopted it. It was a foundation for the modern state. While it was a huge step forward, it also had its limits. For example, it gave women fewer rights than men, placing them under the control of their fathers or husbands. He also fixed the country's broken finances by creating the Bank of France. He reformed the education system, creating new high schools to train future leaders. He built new roads, bridges, and canals. He brought stability and prosperity to a country that had known only turmoil for a decade. The people of France loved him for it. He had given them what they craved most, order and glory. But the fire of his ambition was not satisfied with just being first consul. He wanted more power, more security. In 1802, he was made consul for life. And then, in 1804, he took the final step. He decided he should be an emperor. He argued that making his power hereditary, passed down to his son, would guarantee stability for France forever. The French people, in a vote, overwhelmingly agreed. On December 2nd, 1804, a magnificent ceremony was held at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The Pope himself came from Rome to crown the new emperor. But in a moment of stunning arrogance and symbolism, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands. He turned and placed it on his own head. Then he crowned Josephine as his empress. The message was clear. His power did not come from God or from the church. It came from himself, from his own will and his own achievements. The son of the revolution, who had risen because the old monarchy was destroyed, had now created a new monarchy of his own. As emperor, Napoleon I reached the peak of his power. He was a master of Europe. He led his grand army, perhaps the greatest military force the world had ever seen, in a series of brilliant victories. In 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz, he achieved his most perfect victory. Facing a larger combined army of Austrians and Russians, he used a brilliant strategy of deception. He tricked his enemies into attacking his weak flank, then smashed through their center, winning a decisive victory. The sun that broke through the morning fog on that day became known as the Sun of Austerlitz, a symbol of his shining glory. He redrew the map of Europe. He defeated Prussia, another major power, in just a few weeks. He dissolved the ancient Holy Roman Empire. He placed his brothers and sisters on the thrones of Spain, Holland, and other smaller German and Italian states. It seemed like all of Europe was becoming a Bonaparte family business. His only persistent enemy was Great Britain, an island nation protected by its powerful navy. Napoleon could beat any army on land, but he could not cross the sea to invade England. This frustration would lead to one of his biggest mistakes. To defeat Britain, Napoleon tried to wage economic war. He created the continental system. His plan was like trying to build a giant fence around Britain, a fence made of all the countries in Europe. He commanded every country under his control to stop trading with Britain. He said, "You are not allowed to buy anything from Britain or sell anything to Britain." He hoped this would cripple the British economy, which depended on trade. But the fence was full of holes. People needed British goods, and smuggling was widespread. The system hurt the economies of his European allies more than it hurt Britain. It also created resentment. Countries did not like being told by France who they could and could not trade with. This policy, born of his obsession to defeat Britain, began to weaken the foundations of his empire. The first major crack in his empire appeared in Spain. In 1808, he forced the Spanish king to step down and put his own brother, Joseph, on the throne. Napoleon expected the Spanish people to accept this. He was wrong. The Spanish people rose up in furious rebellion. This was not a war of armies, but a war of the people. It was a guerrilla war, a word that means little war in Spanish. Small groups of Spanish fighters would attack French troops and then disappear into the mountains. Fighting in Spain was not like a formal battle. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. For the French army, it became a nightmare. They called it the Spanish ulcer, a bleeding wound that would not heal. It drained France of soldiers and money for years, a constant distraction from other threats. By this time, a change was happening within Napoleon himself. The young, energetic general was becoming a middle-aged emperor, surrounded by people who told him he was a genius. He started to believe he was invincible. This is the danger of absolute power. It can make you deaf to warnings. He also had a personal crisis. Josephine had not been able to give him a son, an heir to his empire. With a heavy heart, he divorced her in 1810. It was a political decision, but it was also personally painful for both of them. He then married Marie-Louise, the young daughter of the Austrian emperor, the same emperor he had defeated so many times. It was a marriage of politics, designed to secure an alliance and produce an heir. A year later, she gave birth to a son, whom he named Napoleon II, the King of Rome. He finally had his heir, but he had lost the love of his life and married into the old world of royalty he had once fought against. The great turning point, the beginning of the end, came in 1812. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, had begun trading with Britain again, openly defying the continental system. For Napoleon, this was a personal insult and a challenge to his authority. He could not let it go. He made a fateful decision to invade Russia. He gathered the largest European army ever seen, the Grand Army, with over 600,000 soldiers from France and all its allied nations. He was confident of a quick victory. He believed his destiny called him to Moscow. The invasion of Russia was an act of supreme hubris, a believing your own legend. It was like a great ship sailing into a frozen sea, ignoring all the warnings. As Napoleon's army marched deep into the vast plains of Russia, they found no decisive battle. The Russian army kept retreating, burning villages and crops as they went, leaving nothing for the French to eat. Napoleon was drawn deeper and deeper into the immense, empty country. He finally reached Moscow, only to find it mostly deserted and on fire. He had captured a ghost city. He waited in Moscow for weeks, expecting the Tsar to surrender. The surrender never came. As October arrived, Napoleon knew he had to retreat. And then the Russian army's greatest ally attacked, General Winter. The cold came early and with terrifying force. The snow was like a thick white blanket that covered everything. The temperatures dropped far below freezing. For the French soldiers, who were not prepared for such weather, the retreat became a waking nightmare. The cold was a silent, merciless enemy that froze their bodies and their hopes. Thousands starved or froze to death. The retreat from Moscow is one of the most horrific stories in military history. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out alive. The Grand Army was destroyed. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered. Seeing Napoleon so weakened, the other nations of Europe, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Sweden, saw their chance. They joined together in a new coalition against him. It was now a war for the liberation of Europe. Napoleon, with his genius, quickly raised a new army of young boys and old men. He fought with the energy of his youth, winning several small battles. But his enemies were now united and determined. In October 1813, they cornered him at the Battle of Leipzig. It was called the Battle of the Nations, as soldiers from almost every European country were involved. Outnumbered and with his new army exhausted, Napoleon was decisively defeated. The Allied armies then invaded France. For the first time in years, war was on French soil. Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign, but the numbers were against him. Paris was captured in March 1814. His own generals and ministers, seeing that the cause was lost, turned against him and told him he must abdicate, give up his throne. He had no choice. The storm was finally over, or so it seemed. The Allies exiled him to the small island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. They gave him the island as his own tiny kingdom. They thought it was a clever solution. They allowed him to keep his title of emperor and a small personal guard. This was like putting a lion in a large cage and expecting it to be content. From his island, Napoleon watched as the old monarchy was restored to France. The brother of the executed king became King Louis XVIII. The new king was clumsy, and the French people, who had gotten used to the glory of the empire, quickly grew tired of him. They missed their emperor. Napoleon, on Elba, sensed this. The fire inside him was not extinguished. He decided on one last, incredible gamble. After less than a year in exile, in February 1815, he escaped from Elba. He landed in France with about 1,000 soldiers. The king sent an army to arrest him. Napoleon walked forward alone to meet them. He opened his coat and said, "Soldiers, here I am. Kill your emperor, if you wish." The soldiers, who had fought for him for years, threw down their guns, cried, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the emperor!" and joined him. His march to Paris became a triumphant parade. The king fled, and Napoleon entered the capital without firing a single shot. His return to power is known as the 100 Days. The other powers in Europe were shocked and horrified. They declared him an outlaw and immediately prepared for war. Napoleon knew he had to win a fast and decisive victory before his enemies could combine all their forces. He moved his army into Belgium, where two Allied armies were gathering, a British-led army under the Duke of Wellington and a Prussian army under General Blücher. On June 18, 1815, near a small Belgian village called Waterloo, Napoleon fought his final battle. It was a clash of titans. Napoleon against Wellington, two of the greatest generals of the age. The battle raged all day, a bloody and desperate struggle. For much of the day, it seemed Napoleon would win. But Wellington's men held on bravely, and Napoleon made a few crucial mistakes. He was not the same man he had been a decade before. He was ill and seemed less decisive. In the late afternoon, just as the French were on the verge of breaking the British lines, the Prussian army arrived on the battlefield and smashed into Napoleon's side. The French army, attacked from two directions, collapsed and fled. The Battle of Waterloo was over. The 100 Days were finished. The dream was dead. This time, his enemies took no chances. They wanted to send him somewhere so remote he could never escape. They chose St. Helena, a tiny volcanic rock of an island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from anywhere. It was one of the most isolated places on Earth. Here, the man who had once ruled an empire was now a prisoner of the wind and the waves. Napoleon spent the last 6 years of his life on St. Helena, watched over by his British jailers. But he did not sit in silence. He fought one last battle, the battle for his memory. He spent his days dictating his memoirs to a small group of loyal followers. He created his own legend. In his telling, he was not a power-hungry tyrant, but a son of the revolution who wanted to spread liberty and equality across Europe. He was a great modernizer brought down by the jealous old kings. He was a man of the people, a martyr for their cause. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda, and to a large extent, it worked. He died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. His last words were reported to be France, Army, head of the army, Josephine. Even at the end, his mind was on the things that had defined his life, his country, his military glory, and his first love. So, what is the legacy of this incredible man? He is a paradox, a figure of deep contradiction. He was a son of the revolution who became a dictator. He brought legal equality, but also censored the press and created a secret police. He spread revolutionary ideas across Europe, but he did it through conquest and war, causing the deaths of millions. He was a brilliant administrator who built modern institutions, but his endless ambition plunged a continent into chaos for more than a decade. Was he a hero or a villain? A liberator or a tyrant? A genius or a monster? He was perhaps all these things. The storm named Napoleon changed the face of Europe forever. He swept away the last remnants of the old feudal world. He ignited the fire of nationalism, the idea that people with a common language and culture should have their own country. His code, his administrative systems, and his military strategies are still studied today. The lonely boy from a small island, driven by an unquenchable fire to prove his worth, did more than just chase destiny. For a brief, brilliant, and terrible time, he was destiny, and his story serves as a timeless, powerful reminder of the heights a single human life can reach and the terrible price of an ambition that knows no limits.